In the winter of 1991, 9 chefs sat in a private room behind a closed bakery in St. Louis, Missouri, waiting to taste a plate of pork. Not a new sauce, not a fashionable cut. One shoulder from a black, solid-hoofed hog that most farmers in the Ozarks had laughed at 3 years earlier. The woman who raised it was not in the room. She was 52 years old. Her name was Clara Voss. She lived alone on a rocky 76-acre farm outside Ava, Missouri, and she still drove a truck with one door that would not open from the inside. The check waiting for her that week was for $10,200, payment in full for 2 finished hogs. And the strange thing was not that the chefs paid it. The strange thing was that Clara had built the whole thing from one animal everyone else had treated like a mistake. 3 years earlier, at the Douglas County Livestock Barn, Clara Voss stood in the back row with an envelope in her coat pocket and bid $3,800 on a Mulefoot boar. The boar was huge, black, slow-moving, and odd-looking. His hooves were not split like ordinary hogs. They were solid, like little black shoes. He was 39 months old and already past the age when commercial farmers wanted to look at him. The auctioneer called him breeding stock. The men in the bleachers called him a waste of feed. Clara called him the beginning. To understand why, you have to go back to the thing she kept locked in the bottom drawer of her kitchen hutch. It was not money. It was not a deed. It was a stack of oil-dark notebooks written in Danish by her grandfather, Jens Voss, who had crossed the Atlantic in 1936 with one suitcase, a wool coat, and 38 years of breeding records from his family's farm near Ribe. Jens had raised old-world lard hogs before the modern market decided that pork should be fast, pale, lean, and cheap. His notebooks tracked bloodlines, feed schedules, finishing ages, winter mash, acorn lots, skim milk, butcher comments, and one repeated phrase Clara had underlined so many times the paper had begun to weaken. Flavor follows time. Her grandfather had said it at the kitchen table when Clara was 12. Her father had dismissed it when Clara was 30. By 1988, almost everyone in her county had forgotten it completely. The American hog business had changed. 6-month pigs were the standard. Lean carcasses got praise. Fast gain mattered more than slow fat. A hog that needed 2 years was not seen as better. It was seen as broken. But Clara had spent the last 2 years of her mother's life translating those Danish notebooks at the kitchen table while her mother slept in the next room. By the time her mother died, Clara had filled 3 spiral notebooks of her own. She knew the old system was not nostalgia. It was a method. Late finishing, dense fat, forage, milk, grain that had started to ferment, boars chosen for bone, calmness, and depth instead of speed. The old Danish breed from her grandfather's pages no longer existed anywhere Clara could reach. But the Livestock Conservancy had sent her a list of American breeds that still carried pieces of the same answer. Ossabaw, Red Wattle, Mulefoot. The Mulefoot caught her eye because the numbers were terrible. Fewer than 300 breeding animals were thought to remain in the country. Most small farmers had no market for them. They finished slowly, carried too much fat for modern buyers, and looked like they belonged to another century. Which, Clara thought, was exactly the point. A breeder named Otis Reber, 71 years old, lived 40 miles away near Norwood. Arthritis had bent his hands until he could no longer latch gates without pain. He had kept a small Mulefoot herd because his own father had kept them. But he was done. Everything was going to auction. Clara visited him twice before the sale. On the second visit, Otis pointed to a boar standing alone near the back fence. "That one," he said. "If I were young, I'd build around that one." The boar's record name was Raber Black 17. His reserve at auction would be $1,100. Clara went home and opened her grandfather's notebooks to an entry from 1884, where Jens's father had paid almost 5 times the ordinary price for one foundation boar. The note beside that purchase was short. Too much money, unless the blood is right. Clara wrote one number on the back of a feed receipt. $3,800. That was her limit. On the morning of the auction, the barn was cold enough that people kept their gloves on. The barn was cold enough that people kept their gloves on. Cattle buyers filled the first rows. Hog buyers leaned against the rails. Clara stood in the back in a brown wool coat that had belonged to her mother, holding a black purse and saying almost nothing. By noon, Otis Reber's Mulefoots began coming through the ring. Most sold barely above slaughter value. A few went to men who were not even pretending they wanted breeding stock. Then Black 17 entered the pen. He moved slowly, not lazily, but with the heavy patience of an animal that did not need to hurry. The auctioneer read the lot card. 3-year-old proven Mulefoot boar, foundation stock, reserve 1,100. Clara raised her hand. 1,100. A buyer from Springfield lifted 2 fingers. 12. Clara raised again. 13. The buyer smirked. 14. The room was still half asleep until Clara said, 2,000. That woke it up. Men turned around. One man laughed into his coffee. The auctioneer paused long enough to look over his glasses. The Springfield buyer bid 2,200, more to test her than to buy the hog. Clara said 28. The buyer shook his head and said 32. Clara waited, not because she was unsure, because she wanted the room to understand there was a decision being made that it was not part of. 3,800, she said. The buyer dropped his hand. The gavel hit. Sold to Clara Voss. By 3 that afternoon, the joke had already found a name. She was backing her old stock trailer to the loading chute when a farmer named Dale Kincaid stopped beside the gate and looked at the boar. "Clara," he said loudly, "you just paid pickup money for a pig with horse feet." The men by the fence laughed. One of them slapped the rail. The boar stepped into the trailer. Clara closed the latch. She did not answer Dale. She did not correct him. She did not explain the Danish notebooks, the bloodlines, the old feed schedules, or the 2 years she had spent learning the difference between fat that was cheap and fat that carried flavor. She drove home with $3,800 of black foundation stock shifting behind her, and $9,600 left in the bank. For the next 18 months, the joke got better before the farm did. Clara bought 5 Mulefoot gilts from Otis before he sold the rest. She found 2 more through a breeder in northern Arkansas. By winter, she had 1 boar, 7 young sows, and almost no margin for mistakes. The first litters came unevenly. 1 sow crushed 2 piglets. Another failed to breed. A storm flooded the lower lot, and Clara spent half a night moving panels by lantern light while the creek rose black under the sycamores. The feed bill made her stomach tighten every month. By September of 1989, she had 34 pigs on the farm and less than $2,000 in cash. That was when her neighbor Dale Kincaid stopped by. He did not come to apologize. He came to advise. He stood at the fence, watched the black hogs rooting through a patch of hickory mast, and said, "You know, there's still time to cut your losses." Clara looked at the pigs. They were 18 months old and nowhere near the market weight a commercial buyer wanted. To Dale, they looked like a failed business stretching itself out in slow motion. To Clara, they looked exactly like her grandfather's tables. Late growth, deep shoulder, calm temperament, fat setting slowly under the skin. She said, "They are not finished." Dale laughed once. "That's the problem." That winter was the darkest part. A processor in Springfield refused to take them unless she sold at standard commodity price. A feed salesman told her no restaurant would pay for pork with that much fat. A bank officer looked at her numbers and suggested she lease out most of the land instead. The worst moment came in February of 1990. When Clara butchered the first test hog. The carcass was almost 44% fat. The local locker man shook his head. "Nobody wants this anymore." Clara asked him to cut 1 shoulder the way she marked it. She took it home wrapped in white paper, cooked it for 9 hours in a low oven, and sliced it at her kitchen table. The meat was dark, not gray. The fat melted clean. The smell filled the room with smoke, nuts, and something sweet that reminded her of her grandfather's coat when he came in from the barn. She sat there alone with the plate in front of her and cried. Not because she had failed, because for the first time she knew she had not. But knowing it at your own table is not the same as proving it to a market. The proof came through a man named Raymond Pike. Raymond was a butcher in West Plains who had once worked in Kansas City and still knew chefs who cared about meat more than price sheets. Clara brought him 2 loins, 1 shoulder, and 3 pages of notes about age, feed, and hanging time. Raymond expected a hobby farmer. What he got was a production system. The pigs had been finished for 26 months, not 6. They had spent autumn on hickory and acorns, spring on clover, and winter on warm grain mash with skim milk from a neighboring dairy. The breeding records went back through Otis Reber's herd and then into Clara's comparison notes from the Danish books. Raymond tasted the pork the next day. Then he called her. "Let's say it was good," he said. "How many can you raise exactly like this?" That was the first time anyone asked the right question. By autumn of 1990, Raymond had arranged a private tasting in St. Louis with 9 chefs, 2 butchers, and a restaurant buyer who had built his reputation on serving food with a story he could verify. Clara did not go. She sent the hogs, the records, and a handwritten sheet explaining the system. The shoulder was roasted slowly and finished over applewood. The belly was cured for a test batch. The loin was cut thick and cooked with nothing but salt. The chefs were ready to be amused. They were not ready to be quiet. One of them asked why the meat tasted older without tasting strong. Another asked why the fat melted without greasing the plate. The buyer asked for the farm records. Raymond handed him Clara's pages. The room shifted. The story was no longer a woman and a funny pig. It was a system. 2 months later, Clara received the check for $10,200 for 2 finished hogs at $5,100 each. That did not make her rich. It made her right. There is a difference. Rich would have meant the counties suddenly understood. Right meant the farm could keep going long enough for understanding to arrive later. And it did arrive, slowly, in the ordinary way real change arrives, not as applause, as orders. By 1993, Clara had a waiting list for finished hogs. By 1995, chefs from St. Louis, Memphis, and Kansas City were calling Raymond before the animals were even ready. By 1998, the farm carried 3 breeding boars, 22 sows, and enough young stock that Clara had to rebuild the south barn. Dale Kincaid stopped telling the horse feet joke. Other farmers began asking what she fed them. A university extension agent came to take notes and used the phrase regional genetic preservation, which Clara disliked because it made morning chores sound like a committee. She preferred simpler words: breed well, feed right, wait long enough. The most important part of the story was not the chefs, though they made the checks possible. It was not the boar, though without him there was no herd. It was not even the notebooks, though they had carried a lost method across an ocean. The most important part happened one Saturday in April of 1991, a few weeks after the St. Louis check cleared. A 15-year-old girl named Hattie Bell came up the lane on a bicycle. Her father worked nights at the sawmill. Her family had rented the old Mercer place down the road. She asked Clara if she could help after school in exchange for learning the pigs. Clara looked at her hands first. That was what her grandfather had done with people. Hattie's hands were small, scratched, and not afraid of work. So Clara handed her a feed bucket. For 30 years the work moved that way, from notebooks to chores, from chores to records, from records to breeding decisions made in the cold before sunrise. Black 17 died in 1996, old for a working boar. Clara buried him above the lower pasture where the hickory trees drop nuts every October. By then, he had produced the foundation of a herd that outlived him. By 2004, animals from Clara's line had gone to farms in 5 states. By 2010, restaurants that once would not have bought a fat hog were putting her pork on menus with the breed name printed in full. 2019, when Clara could no longer lift feed sacks without pain, Hattie was running the breeding records. And by the time Clara died in 2022, the thing people remembered about that auction had changed. The old men no longer told the part about the pig with horse feet as a joke. They told it as the first sign that Clara had known something the room did not. That is how small communities revise history. First they laugh, then they watch, then they claim they always suspected. But Clara had never needed them to suspect. She only needed the animal to be what the records said he was. She only needed the work to be older than the laughter. And it was. A laugh can fill an auction barn for 10 seconds. A herd can fill a valley for 30 years.